Hello, everybody. What's up? Welcome back to the Riley Lewis Show. I am your host, Riley Lewis. So, we have some interesting things to talk about today. I'm going to cover some coronavirus stuff. I just want to say that it's very ironic to me because when I originally set out on this podcast, I was not planning on talking about coronavirus much because that's so widely covered in the mainstream media, but I don't know. I find some of the stuff's actually kind of important, and I mean all of it's important, but some of the stuff is particularly important, and I think that it needs to be covered, so I want to cover it. So whatever, we're here. So in any case, by the way, really quickly, if you want to help me out, please hit that subscribe button down below, like this video, or you can leave me a comment in the comment section. Let me know how I'm doing. You'll also find a link in the description of this video to my Patreon account where you can sign up, become a member, make a donation. Okay, cool. So, our first article basically comes to us from the New York Times. This is about the widespread mistrust of the coronavirus vaccine and some of the implications. Basically saying that, basically at the headline level, you could reasonably guess that there might be an increase in the spread of the virus, if especially if there's a strong resistance to the vaccine when it's on the market. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories around the vaccine and Bill Gates being involved, but I think the honest to God truth is that a lot of people are working really hard to try to get a vaccine approved through human clinical trials, patented, and then on the market. I think that it's as simple as that. That said, on that note, the New York Times, this article is mentioning that billions are being poured into developing a vaccine. However, it seems like there are a lot of people who are already prone to being hesitant to vaccines who are now even more so. And this actually relates to one of the themes I've been talking about a lot in my recent episodes about political rhetoric, especially around vaccines. Especially around election years. So, just for some context here, we're in an election year. It's the summer, mid to late summer. We're getting closer and closer to November when we go out to vote, when we all go out to the ballot box and perform that ritual. And sometimes, I should say all times, there will be political rhetoric oftentimes around elections from all sorts of sides and all different candidates, certainly from Joe Biden and Donald Trump, that might amplify pre-existing tensions or things that were already present within our politics our culture. And a resilient state is a state in which communities, families, individuals, companies are able to withstand the political rhetoric that does heighten that tension without, again, devolving or completely collapsing. That's something I think that we really need to work on. Being able to withstand heightened political rhetoric, especially about sensitive issues, without unfriending each other, blocking each other, trying to cancel each other, getting so mad that we, throw our phone in the wall or delete each other's number or stop talking to each other. We need to be able to be much more mature than that. We need to be able to have disagreements, especially in sensitive, heightened times, such as elections, which are very vulnerable for any state. An election is a very vulnerable event, meaning it's just a very sensitive event, and it's a very significant event, especially for a democracy and a republic. So, in any case, we've certainly seen that before Corona, there were certain people who were already hesitant of vaccines and are even more hesitant now. And this article actually puts some of this responsibility on the president by saying, quote, President Trump and leaders worldwide say they are racing to develop. Oh, wait. This is actually, maybe that's later. Hold on. There was a little bit later. You'll see. Almost daily, President Trump and leaders worldwide say they are racing to develop a coronavirus vaccine in perhaps the most urgent mission in the history of medical science. But the repeated assurances of near miraculous speed are exacerbating a problem that has largely been overlooked, and one that public health experts say must be addressed now: persuading people to actually get the shot. A growing number of polls find so many people saying they would not get a coronavirus vaccine that its potential to shut down the pandemic could be in jeopardy. which is not good, by the way, right? I mean, this is what this has all been about. We can't cripple the economy. We can't devastate the economy and let that go to waste. So if we have a vaccine, everybody needs to get it. No ifs, ands, or buts. Um, I mean, and vaccines, by the way, I mean, that's why we don't have smallpox outbreaks or cholera outbreaks or polio anymore. That's why teenagers don't walk around with iron lungs anymore, because we developed a vaccine. So for my friends who are very hesitant about vaccines, I would reassure you that vaccines are very widely proven, and there's so much data and evidence in the literature about um, about how effective vaccines truly can be. In any case, back to this article, distrust of it is particularly pronounced in African American communities, which have been disproportionately devastated by the virus, which is true. But even many staunch supporters of immunization say they are wary of this vaccine. The bottom line is I have absolutely no faith in the FDA and in the Trump administration, said Joan Barnes, a retired fourth grade teacher from Fairbanks, Alaska, who said she was otherwise always scrupulously up to date on getting her shots, including those for shingles, flu, and pneumonia. I just feel like there's a rush to get a vaccine out, so I'm very hesitant. Well, of course there's a rush because we have an unprecedented number of deaths around the world and spiking in the United States and in many states that are reopening. And I don't know if we can afford another shutdown at all. We couldn't really afford the first one. So, yeah, there are definitely people who are on a go, on the rush, if you will, to try to get to a vaccine. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're overlooking science or safety, but that means that a lot of people are working cooperatively and they're working around the clock. Anyway, back to this article. Mistrust of vaccines has been on the rise in the US in recent years, a sentiment that resists categorization by political party, educational background, or socioeconomic demographics. All true. It has been fanned by a handful of celebrities, but now anti-vaccine groups are attracting a new type of clientele altogether. Jackie Schlegel, founder of Texans for Vaccine Choice, which presses for school vaccine exemptions, said that her group's membership has skyrocketed since April. Our phones are ringing off the hook with people saying, I've gotten every vaccine, but I'm not getting this one. How do I opt out? She often hears callers say things like they're not coming to your house to force vax you. I mean, this is just ridiculous. I mean, this is about public health, and I think that we've injected our politics into a public health issue, and that's why we have such a bad communication breakdown, and that's where we need to stop. We need to eject our politics from the situation and really roll with the science. And I'll admit, I've been very skeptical of the FDA, the CDC, our certain leaders like Andrew Cuomo, certain Governor Newsom, certain leaders at the World Health Organization, and rightfully so because they've given us reason to be skeptical. That said, vaccines are a no-brainer, and I certainly hope that the minute we have one, everybody starts lining up for a drive-through vaccine. We need to. This is how we're gonna beat this. And if you're sitting there saying I miss life before this, or I want something better, or I just want my job back, or I want a new job, or I want to go out to the movies again, I want to go to the beach again. If you're in that boat, you should be on board with this, because the sooner that we can do this, the sooner we can move on. So that's what we should do. And I actually think that they're right. They're right to point out that there is a nationwide task force of 23 epidemiologists who are far more qualified than me, and then I'm guessing you, unless you're an epidemiologist. There's a task force of 23 epidemiologists and vaccine behavior specialists that have released a detailed report, which itself has gotten little attention, but it's saying that such work was urgent. Operation Warp Seed, the $10 billion public-private partnership that is driving much of the vaccine research, they wrote, quote, rests upon the compelling yet unfound presupposition that if we build it, they will come. Which is quite an important assumption. If we build it, they will come. That is something that is very important to assume, and that's something that I don't know is necessarily true or not. So, that said, let's move on to some other things. So, a recent frontline civil rights leader, someone who, John Lewis, someone who is very well known in the world of civil rights, has recently died. And in the name of his spirit and in the spirit of civil rights, I want to talk about some of the protests that have been going on and really, ask you and, just for open conversation, how is it that we're going to, I mean, what is the whole civil rights movement about? What was the civil rights movement about? If you ask Dr. Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement was about, and really, if you even ask Frederick Douglass, much before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement was about abolishing the oppressive policies that were denying African Americans, Indigenous Americans, women their humanity, but also the civil rights movement was about fighting for the constitutional rights that are guaranteed on paper to actually, in effect, be practiced. The civil rights movement was about making sure that the clause, all men are created equal, and women, and, non-binary, right? Just all people are created equal. We were not living up to that. We were not living up to that constitutional promise. And the civil rights movement was about holding our government accountable, making sure that they held up their end of the promise, and that they lived up to their word. That's what the civil rights movement was about. It was not about making yourself feel better on social media. It was not about trying to be really popular or using, slogans on social media, because honestly, let's be real. Posting on your Instagram story does nothing to better the trajectory or the quality of life in African American communities. It does nothing. We have to hold ourselves to a much higher standard if we actually want real progress. We need to invest in these communities. We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to invest in, actual banking and finance and financial literacy. We need to get kids good education and get people access to healthcare, to justice resources, to quality, work opportunity. We also need to, abandon extremist narratives that dehumanize African American people. And I think that through this, lens, we can also talk about police brutality. So we have a lot of good things that we can do, but none of them are going to happen if we just burn everything to the ground. So I think that there are a lot of people, I saw this clip, I should say, the other day of a Portland police officer, an African American officer, and he had something very interesting to say. He said that he thought it was very ironic, or I'm sorry, he said that it really says something when you're at a BLM, protest or event, and most of the protesters are white, and most of the police officers are non-white. And we've seen at this point clips of white people running up to African American law enforcement officers and telling them that they are part of the problem. That is peak lunacy. So we are not going to achieve justice or freedom, which, by the way, cannot exist without each other. Justice and freedom need each other to exist themselves. But white people, I can say this because I'm white. To my other, white people, white friends, dear white people, we are not going to get justice or any sort of change or progress by running up to African American officers and telling them that they are part of the problem. And if you think that you have the privilege to do that, um, I'm saddened by that, because that is so ironic and so silly, and that's patently absurd. And it's also just not true, by the way. We shouldn't be judging we should never judge a book by its cover. So running up to an officer or anyone that you don't know and just making accusations is obviously something that's silly and not productive, and it's also not going to, benefit anything. It's not going to contribute to any reasonable discourse or any meaningful change. So that is the sort of behavior that we have been seeing nationwide that we need to abandon. And I just, I think to myself, would John Lewis be proud of what he's saying? Would John Lewis be proud of us, or do we think, do you guys think that John Lewis, who was a civil rights leader that preached nonviolence while he was enduring beatings and jailings, would probably feel more like Martin Luther King Jr., who said that we would wear down the oppressor with our capacity to suffer. That's literally what Martin Luther King Jr. said, and John Lewis, I think, took the Martin Luther King Jr. side of the coin when it came to the civil rights movement. And so I ask, would he be proud of us right now for our actions? I mean, and also I would ask, I'd invite all of my, brothers and sisters who are in the streets angry. I would ask them, I mean, does the violence make you feel better? Do you feel proud? Do you notice any meaningful change happening because of it? Because of your actions? I don't really think so. So let's talk about John Lewis a little bit, and then we'll wrap things up. But John Lewis's death was announced in statements from his family and from Nancy Pelosi just recently. Advisors to the senior Democratic leaders confirmed that he died July 17th, but other details were not immediately available. Mr. Lewis, who was a Georgia Democrat, announced his diagnosis of pancreatic cancer on December 29th of last year and said he planned to continue working amid treatment. Quote, "I have been in some kind of fight for freedom, equality, basic human rights for nearly my entire life." Then he said, quote, "I have never faced a fight quite like the one I have now." And I can completely empathize with that, because my father right now has stage 4 kidney cancer, and it's really brutal and tragic, and it's very aggressive. So it is really one hell of a fight. So, for those who beat cancer, that's just the best thing in the whole world. Being surviving it, getting through it. His last public appearance, he came out at a Black Lives Matter, he made his last public appearance at Black Lives Matter Plaza with D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser on June 7th, 2 days after taping a virtual town hall online with former President Barack Obama. While Mr. Lewis was not a policy maven as a lawmaker, he served the role of conscience of the Democratic caucus on many matters. His reputation as keeper of the 1960s flame defined his career in Congress. When President George H.W. Bush vetoed a bill easing requirements to bring employment discrimination suits in 1990, Mr. Lewis rallied support for its revival. It became law as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1991. It took a dozen years, but in 2003 he won authorization for construction of the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall. In 2012, when Paul Brune, a Republican from Georgia, proposed eliminating funding for one aspect of the Voting Rights Act, Mr. Lewis denounced the move as shameful, and the amendment died. Mr. Lewis's final years in the House were marked by personal conflict with President Trump, Russia's interference in the 2016 election, Mr. Lewis said, rendered Trump's victory illegitimate. He boycotted Trump's inauguration. Later during the House's formal debate on whether to proceed with the impeachment process, Mr. Lewis had evinced no doubts, saying, "For some, this vote might be hard, but we have a mandate and a mission to be on the right side of history." So the headline is that Mr. Lewis was clearly a very admirable person who was a very principled person, and I think that it would be very inspiring if we could return back to that sort of principle. And I do think that many of us are looking inward and awakening and, at least discovering what principles, are, or what principles that we would like to have, or what values we would like to, support in our life. That said, obviously President Trump was freely and fairly elected by 63 plus million people, and when Russian bots post fake ads on Facebook, that doesn't change what happens in the ballot box. So, I have mixed feelings politically with Mr. Lewis, but I will honor his spirit as someone who did, stand by his principles and fight for human rights and advocate for civil rights, because that is a noble and a good cause. That said, I do think that we have to be careful here because, you know, we're really starting to see this in modern civil rights too, where it's really two-sided. There's almost two sides of the brain of the modern civil rights movement. And I do want to make this point really quickly before we end, but on one hand, because I even noticed this in a peace program that I'm in, that's a peace program. On one hand, you think people want peace, they want justice, they want to advocate for basic human rights. But on the other hand, that does not universally apply. It only applies to people you politically agree with. And so we're really starting to segregate ourselves. What I should say is our modern civil rights movements, ironically, are much more exclusionary than inclusionary, because at least, if you recall the Harper's letter or Barry Weiss's resignation from the New York Times, we're seeing a vengeful cancel culture in which anybody who does not kowtow to the mainstream dogma of the select few in the mainstream media or, the political establishment, then you're canceled. And so I just really want to point out here that if our end goal is peace, truly non-violence, then we need to abandon extremist narratives of all time, and we need to focus on building an accountable, inclusive system in which we try to prevent the threat of violence and actual outbreaks of violence. So that said, I think that, what I hope to see, what I hope to be as what I hope to be the change that I would like to see in the world, and as a peacemaker, I would like to just say that I think what's most important to me is trying to focus less on being positional politically and actually focus on things like accountability, inclusion, bottom up, top down approaches that, bring everybody into the conversation. I think about that. I believe Adolph Oak's quote from 1896 about the New York Times, saying, "Let the foundations of the let the pillars of the New York Times, be the forum for open discussion and, questions of all things about public interest, and, let it be, about open discussion from people from all sides." So I just think that we actually need to return to that. Anyway, I'm sorry if that was kind of tangential, sort of piggyback there onto a different topic that I've been meaning to say, but, this is really just because I've been seeing so many protests in Portland. I've seen so much police on civilian violence, civilian on civilian violence. We have Mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, telling us that New York City is incredibly safe, even though their homicide rate is up like 150%. So I just really want to emphasize the fact that my number one priority at all times is non-violence. And I think one of the things about promoting non-violence is preventing these sort of extremist political narratives that, even our finest, leaders, and including Mr. John Lewis, succumb to, because we're people. And it's really easy to succumb to these narratives. So I think that we need to abandon this sort of, back and forth, or, black and white. It's this way or it's that way, and one way is morally right and one way is morally wrong. And I guess I should say specifically in this case, this is something you hear a lot, but politicians will tell you that they want to be on the right side of history, and that's a great way of trying to diplomatically force your agenda down somebody's throat. So I just want to say that anytime you hear politicians say we want to be on the right side of history, it's not really about justice, it's about performance. Okay, everybody, thank you for listening to The Riley Lewis Show. I appreciate your time. Again, if you want to support me, you can hit that subscribe button down below. I really appreciate it. You can also like this video, or you can leave me a comment in the comment section down below and let me know how I'm doing. While you're down there, you'll find a link in the description to my Patreon page where you can sign up, become a member, make a donation. The Riley Lewis Show is also available on Anchor.fm, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. And again, I appreciate your time today. I hope you had fun and I hope you learned something. And I'll see you here again tomorrow. You've been listening to The Riley Lewis Show.